Hi, welcome back to my channel. I've been gone for a couple weeks because this case took so much effort and research because there was a lot of information to sift through. So this is going to be a fairly long video, as you can probably see after editing this. I hope you consider subscribing if you enjoy true crime and commentary content. Can't speak apparently. Anyways, since it's October, my favorite month and favorite season, which is Halloween, as you can see, I've done Joker-esque makeup, so that's why I look like this. Not that it's that much different from my regular makeup. Anyways, today we're going to be talking about a Canadian serial killer named Bruce McArthur, who was only caught 3 years ago in 2017. So let's get into it. Thomas Donald Bruce McArthur, who he's known publicly just as Bruce McArthur, was born on October 8, 1951 in Lindsay, Ontario, to parents Isley and Malcolm McArthur. Bruce grew up on a farm run by his parents, but his parents also fostered many kids from the city of Toronto. At any given time, there would be 6 to 10 foster kids living with Bruce and his family, but Bruce also had a biological sister named Sandy, who he remained close to for the entirety of his life. Bruce grew up in a very small rural community, so his elementary school was a one-room schoolhouse, which is essentially just like the school is comprised of one classroom, and every grade K through 8, I believe, at the elementary school was taught in one classroom by like one or a couple teachers. Through his elementary experience, Bruce didn't really fit in with his peers, especially his male peers, so he spent most of his time trying to like suck up to teachers or please the adults around him rather than trying to fit in with kids. He was actually known as a tattletale at his elementary school and would often tell on other kids to teachers when they did something wrong. It's also reported that Bruce felt really out of place in his community and in his school because he was more feminine than the other boys, and he felt really inadequate at home because he felt like he didn't meet up to his dad's expectation of what a son should be. Like, he was too feminine, he was more of a mama's boy. His parents had a reputation around town for being really good people, so Bruce didn't suffer any extreme abuse or neglect as a child, but he did feel not accepted by his father and his community. His parents were both very evangelical about their religions, but they belonged to different sects of faith, of I think Christianity. His mom was an Irish Catholic, where his dad was a Scottish Presbyterian. This led to a lot of like existential and various religious arguments between the couple, in which Bruce would often insert himself and take his mom's side, which resulted in even more tension in Bruce's relationship with his father. Throughout his childhood, Bruce was aware of his same-sex attraction, but always repressed his feelings because it wasn't really normal in his town, and there was no like out gay people in the 1950s and 60s in Lindsay, Ontario. This probably added to his feelings of inadequacy and isolation that he experienced growing up. He attended a nearby high school named Fenelon Falls Secondary School, which was located in a nearby town of Fenelon Falls. While in high school, he met a lady named Janice Campbell, who shortly after high school would become his wife. The couple graduated high school in 1970 and married 5 years later when they were both 23 years old. Their marriage started out pretty average. There was no notable like tension or conflicts that they experienced. They would only start to fall apart and away from each other decades later because of Bruce's innermost feelings and actions. Shortly after marriage, Janice and Bruce moved away from their small towns and moved to a slightly bigger suburban city called Oshawa. It is believed in his early 20s, Bruce worked at this department store that's now defunct called Eaton's. Eatons. The Eatons that he supposedly worked at is located in downtown Toronto, or was located in downtown Toronto, where the Eaton Centre is. Currently, the Eaton Centre is just like a mall in downtown Toronto if you don't live in Canada. There is some speculation or theories that his new surroundings at his work were very interesting to Bruce. During the 1970s in Toronto, there was a thriving LGBTQ plus community in downtown Toronto. There was a lot of like gay bars and baths and stuff like that located on Church and Wesley, which is now known as the Gay Village. Anyways, so many who reviewed sort of Bruce's case, many psychologists and theorists and stuff that reviewed Bruce's case, theorized that him being exposed to this thriving gay community sort of like reawakened the repressed same-sex attraction that he had in himself. But for this part of his life, it's speculated that Bruce just sort of continued on in his heterosexual marriage with Janice, and other couples that knew of Bruce and Janice in the 1970s said that they just seemed like every other normal married couple. I don't think Janice has ever really spoken publicly about her marriage with Bruce and what it was like, so it's hard to say what their partnership was like during their marriage. Sadly, in the mid-1970s, it was discovered that Bruce's father Malcolm had a brain tumor, and his health deteriorated so quickly that he was put into a home where he could receive 24/7 care in the last few years of his life. Bruce's relationships with his parents sort of took a complete 180 during the mid-1970s because Bruce reported that after the diagnosis, his father started opening up to him and started expressing his love and care for Bruce, which really helped bond the two. But Bruce's relationship with his mother became extremely strained because after his father's diagnosis, Isley, his mother, started dating a different man, and Bruce found this to be like the ultimate betrayal that his mom would go out and pursue a new relationship when his dad was sick. Tragically, both of Bruce's parents would die before Bruce turned 30. His mother died in 1978 from cancer. I'm unsure of when she was diagnosed, and his father passed in 1981. He left his job at Eaton's in around 1978 and started a new job as a traveling socks salesman for a company called McGregor Socks. Essentially, he would just go around to different department stores throughout Ontario and try to get them to sell his product in the stores. Janice and Bruce bought their first house in Oshawa in 1979, and they had their first child, a daughter named Melanie. 2 years later, in 1981, the couple had their second child, a son named Todd. It was said that Bruce remained extremely devoted to his Christian roots through his 20s and 30s, and he would attend Mass every Sunday with his family. Bruce would later say that he sort of used his devotion to Christ and his faith as a distraction from the same-sex attraction that he was feeling. In 1990, Bruce started having sexual trysts with other men behind his wife's back. To me, it's a little... I don't 100% believe that this is when Bruce started experimenting with his sexuality, because he's so impulsive, as you'll see, and he sort of only does things for his own satisfaction, that I feel like this is when he finally admitted to his sexual affairs with men. Anyways, after sort of a year of having affairs behind his wife's back, he confessed to his wife that this was happening and that he was in fact gay. Surprisingly, the couple still stayed together for a few more years after this confession, just trying to work it out and just raise their kids together, I guess. In 1993, Bruce ended his career as a salesman of socks and underwear. The couple sort of started to struggle financially towards the mid-1990s because of a variety of factors. One was that Bruce, I don't know if he lost or he quit his job at McGregor Socks or the underwear company he worked for, but because of that loss of income they were suffering. But their son Todd was also a huge strain on their financial security. Teenage Todd started having issues with harassing women. He would just find anonymous women or random phone numbers belonging to women and call them hundreds and hundreds of times, harassing them, saying sexual innuendos, threatening them sexually, stuff like that. So he started, shortly after this, these women would report it to the police. So Todd had a lot of legal trouble starting in his teenage years, and his parents had to pay for lawyers and legal fees and stuff like that, which put them into even more debt. To this day, Todd remains being an ultimate creep. The apple does not fall too far from the tree with Todd and Bruce, just saying. In 2014, Todd was sentenced to 17 months in jail after harassing a woman he didn't even know and threatening to leak her naked pictures. In 2018, he was again in trouble for a similar criminal harassment offense while his father Bruce was undergoing his legal battle and charges in the court. I sort of find it interesting that Todd is this way, because is this a result from how Bruce parented, or is he modeling behavior that he saw from his father? Because his father is extraordinarily creepy, as I'll soon get into. So it's just interesting to note, but we don't really know how Bruce raised his kids, how well, so we'll never know, I guess. After years of trying to make their failing relationship work, Bruce and Janice finally separated in 1997. Bruce decided he was going to move to Toronto by himself to sort of explore his sexuality and be close to Toronto's thriving gay community. When he moved away, his kids were 16 and 18 respectively. Bruce moved into his first apartment on Don Mills Road, which is located in downtown Toronto. He started frequenting gay bars and making a lot of friends while he was out and about socializing. At this time, Bruce said he entered into his first serious same-sex relationship that lasted for around 4 years. The man that he was in this relationship remains unknown to this day. The couple eventually broke up because Bruce said the man didn't 100% want to commit to a monogamous relationship. Bruce's divorce and separation from this first boyfriend both happened around the same time in 1999 to 2000, and Bruce said that his mental health started struggling as a result of both of these stressors. He also had declared bankruptcy in the year of 1999, so that added to it as well. So he actually went and sought out mental health help. The psychiatrist didn't really see anything too abnormal or aggressive in Bruce's behavior. They just diagnosed him with depression, and they prescribed him antidepressants that Bruce said he took for around 6 months to a year. Then comes Bruce's first record of being extremely aggressive, which happens on Halloween night of 2001. Bruce had made friends with a male sex worker that lived and worked in downtown Toronto. I believe they came into contact with each other through like a sex talk line, and that's where he met. A few weeks before or like prior to the assault, they did meet up to have sex. So on October 31st, 2001, Bruce and this male sort of got into contact somehow, and this male invited Bruce up to his apartment so he could see his Halloween costume. The pair didn't have sex that night at all, but when the man turned around to sort of get his Halloween costume on, Bruce physically assaulted him. Bruce had started working as a landscaper a few years before this, so when he went to the man's apartment, he brought some of his tools with him, including a metal pipe. The male sex worker turned around and Bruce bashed him over the head repeatedly with the metal pipe tape and then fled the apartment. Fortunately, the man regained consciousness shortly afterwards, and he was able to call emergency services and get treated for his wounds. Sometime shortly after this, Bruce went to a local law enforcement department and reported that he had believed he had physically assaulted someone, but he didn't know why he did it. He claimed to the police that he had blacked out right before he started the assault, and when he came to, or when he zoned back in, the man was on the floor lying in a pool of blood. Luckily, the victim's injuries weren't too extreme. He did receive surgery and had to go through 6 weeks of physiotherapy. In April of 2003, Bruce went to court for charges for the assault. Prior to his sentencing hearing, Bruce underwent a psychiatric assessment, and these psychiatrists or doctors concluded that Bruce was not at high risk for reoffending, so they didn't believe that giving him a jail sentence would help. Stupid. They're all stupid, just saying. So this translated to Bruce receiving a conditional sentence of 729 days or 2 days less a year. So this meant that he was given 1 year of house arrest. Then the following 6 months he would have a curfew, which meant he had to legally be home at night at a certain time. And then 3 years of probation. He was also ordered to not enter Toronto's gay village unless for medical appointments or work, stay at least 10 meters from the victim's home or workplace. He couldn't spend time with male sex workers, couldn't possess firearms for 10 years, and couldn't purchase or take drugs without a medical possession, specifically poppers. So essentially, Bruce received 0 jail time for bludgeoning this poor man. It was theorized that Bruce's blacking out during the assault was caused by him taking a drug called poppers, which is commonly used by gay men before sex because it is a muscle relaxant, so it relaxes your bum before sex. Anyways, he took poppers in combination with anti-seizure medication that he was taking because I believed he was diagnosed with epilepsy, and it caused him to black out. In 2002, while waiting for his trial to start, Bruce opened up a dating profile on this sort of BDSM fetish website that was specifically for gay men. On his profile, Bruce said that he was looking for submissive men of any age and that he wanted to see how much you could take. Over basically the next 15 years, Bruce would join a variety of gay dating sites and kink sites, including Silver Daddies, Man Jam, Grindr, Bear 411, Bear Forest, Scruff, Daddy Hunt, Squirt, and Growler. Around 2007 or 2008, Bruce moved into a new apartment in Thorncliffe Park, which was only a few blocks away from Toronto's gay village. Shortly after his 2003 conviction, Bruce sort of became infamous in Toronto's gay community as being really into bondage, sadism, and rough sex. His banishment from Toronto's gay village was also really well known amongst locals, and people knew to stay away from him. He had such a bad reputation that if people in the village saw Bruce interacting with another male, they would go up to that male later and warn them to stay away from Bruce. One example of this happened to a man named Robert James. The pair became sort of friends, and Bruce started confiding in James about his really bad relationship with his son Todd. Bruce said that Todd wouldn't accept Bruce's sexuality and that they were really struggling to get over that. But James started distancing himself from Bruce after someone told him that Bruce was dangerous and a little off. Eventually, Bruce confronted James about distancing himself, and James was honest and said that others in the community had warned him against associating with Bruce. Bruce immediately became enraged and said something along the lines of, quote, "I'm tired of these fucking F slurs," telling stories about me. There was a separate instance where Bruce was extremely aggressive when he was asked to leave a second cup on Church Street. He was sort of acting in a way that got him kicked out. I don't really know how he's acting, it doesn't specify, but when they asked him to leave, Bruce got up and made a scene, and all the glass containers on the counter, he wiped them off and broke them all. At some point in the early 2000s, Bruce opened up his own business called Artistic Design, but it was just basically he was a glorified gardener, and most of his clients were older women who found him charming. When his son Todd was convicted for criminal harassment charges in 2014, he was let out on bail but was required to live with his father downtown while on parole. A former friend of Todd's remembers going over to Bruce's apartment to visit Todd one day, and when he went to the bathroom, there was a wall that was just full of naked men, and then when this friend asked Todd about him, Todd said that it was just his dad's friends. So now we move on to Bruce's history of serial killing. So from 2010 to 2017, Bruce McArthur murdered 8 men that we know about. It is speculated that he has many more victims over the decades that he has been alive that haven't been found yet. The common attributes that most of the 8 victims of Bruce McArthur's had was that they had ties to Toronto's gay village, some physical similarities, like a lot of them had facial hair or beards, and most were of South Asian or Middle Eastern descent. Bruce's first known victim was a man named Skanda. I can't pronounce his full name, so I'll put it on the screen so I don't completely butcher it and embarrass myself. Skanda had known Bruce since 1999, and they started dating in the 2000s while Skanda worked for Bruce's landscaping business. The pair sort of off and on dated for a pretty long time, beginning in like 2000 and ending around 2008. Their relationship wasn't monogamous, it was an open relationship, and it has been reported that Bruce was extremely kind and even in some instances abusive to Skanda. Skanda had immigrated to Canada from Sri Lanka in, I believe, the 1990s to provide for his family back home. When he lived in Sri Lanka, he had to hide his same-sex attraction and relationship from his family, but when he immigrated to Canada and moved to Toronto, he was able to sort of explore his same-sex attraction. He is remembered by his family and friends as being an incredibly kind and charismatic person. His brother said that Skanda had a jovial character since childhood. Skanda would send money back home to Sri Lanka every month because he wanted his family to live a better life. He was also extremely passionate about the environment and advocated to protect the wildlife in Sri Lanka. His family back home was unaware that Skanda was gay, and he had no relatives that lived in Canada. He was the only one. Skanda was last seen on September 6, 2010, which was Labor Day weekend in 2010, leaving a bar called Zippers, which was a gay bar. It's now closed. With an unidentified man when he was 40 years old. He was reported missing a few days later on either September 10th or 11th by close friend Jean-Guy Cloutier. I don't know, it's a French last name that I cannot pronounce. I'm so sorry. I'm going to be butchering names throughout this entire video, and my sincerest apologies. I'm so sorry, I'm dumb. Anyways, Jean reported Skanda missing after he became concerned because he hadn't heard from Skanda for a few days. It was reported that Skanda would text Jean every morning. His friends were also extremely concerned when they went to Skanda's apartment and discovered his newly adopted dog by himself in the apartment, or by themselves. I don't know if it's a he or she baby dog. They all knew that Skanda wouldn't leave his puppy like that. Skanda would be missing for more than 8 years when his body was finally found in 2018. home. Abdul Basir Fazi, known as Basir, who was 42, was last seen on December 28th, 2010, and this would be Bruce McArthur's second victim. He was last seen around 7 p.m. leaving his workplace in Mississauga, which is around 45 minutes away from downtown Toronto. Basir was a closeted gay man and had been for many years. He lived with his wife and his 2 children in Brampton, who had no idea that he was gay. Basir immigrated to Canada from Afghanistan at some point in his childhood. Basir was living in Iran, and he confided into one of his school friends that he was gay. His school friend said that he had to either find God or leave. Although he was struggling with his sexuality, Basir loved his family and loved his 2 daughters more than anything. A colleague said that at the time of his murder, Basir was working overtime at work to ensure that he could get every single Christmas gift that his daughters wanted. On the evening of December 28th, Basir had called his wife after work to notify her that he would be coming home late because he was going out to a bar with a work colleague. This was a little bit unusual because Basir worked around 12-hour shifts, so he was usually extremely exhausted and would return home from work and just pass out. When he hadn't arrived home by midnight, his wife called again, but he didn't answer and never called her back. He was reported missing the next day on December 29th to Peel Regional Police by his cousin. Around a week later, Basir's car, which was a 2002 Nissan, was found on Moore Avenue, but there was no damage or anything suspicious to the car. When police later looked into his bank records, it was discovered that after his work shift, he went to downtown Toronto to the Toronto's Gay Village. He stopped at the Black Eagle, which is a gay bar, and Steamworks Bathhouse, which is a sauna for gay men, which are both located on Church Street. His last purchase was at a burger joint that was also located on Church Street. It was later discovered that Basir often visited Toronto's Gay Village. Sadly, his wife filed for divorce a few years later after a police officer told her that Basir had probably abandoned his family and was never coming back. Bruce's third known victim was 58-year-old Majid Hamid Kayhan. I'm so sorry if I mispronounced that. Like Basir, Hamid was an immigrant from Afghanistan. He had fled with his wife and children in the late 1980s. His wife and him divorced in 2002, but Hamid remained closeted because of his upbringing. Hamid's father was a Muslim cleric, and he didn't feel like he could come out as gay to his family. A bartender from Toronto's gay community said that Hamid had frequented gay bars in Toronto's Gay Village since the 1990s and would often spend the night with his partner, who was also closeted at the time. After his partner passed away, Hamid briefly dated Bruce McArthur, but not much is known about the real depth of their relationship. It is said that Bruce and Hamid knew each other because they both frequented the same bars and coffee shops. He was last seen on October 18th, 2012 by a friend around the area of Alexander and Yonge Street, which is located in downtown Toronto. He was reported missing a week later on October 25th, 2012 by his adult son. So after the disappearance of Skanda, police and Skanda's friends searched wooded areas near Riverdale Park, which was a popular place at the time for gay men to meet and hook up downtown. They brought in cadaver dogs and various other specialized services, but nothing was found. 2 years later, in November 2012, the Toronto police held an 18-month investigation that they later called Project Houston, with the initial goal of finding out what happened to Skanda in 2010. The Toronto police believed that Skanda had been murdered, but at the time they didn't have any suspects. After investigators came across a 2012 post on a cannibal website called Zambian Meat, where a poster said that they had killed a man in Toronto and eaten him, Project Houston was born because they believed the post was about Skanda. They briefly theorized that Luca Magnotta, who is a Canadian convicted killer and cannibal, who is the focus of the 2020 documentary Netflix documentary called Don't Fuck with Cats, might have murdered Skanda. After Luca Magnotta was ruled out, they thought it might be a retired medical technician from Peterborough, Ontario, named James Alex Brunton. He was cleared as a suspect in Skanda's murder, but was indicted on charges of making and distributing child pornography after it was discovered that he had made a sexual contract that involved cannibalism with a teenager from Colorado. The cannibal route was eventually dismissed 6 months into Project Houston. In June 2013, the Toronto police expanded Project Houston to include the disappearances of Basir and Hamid because of their similarities to Skanda's disappearance. They were all middle-aged immigrants of South Asian descent who had disappeared in Toronto's gay village. At this point, investigators believed that all three men had been taken against their will. It was later released that Project Houston investigators did actually interview Bruce McArthur after they received an anonymous tip about him. Police also found evidence that Bruce knew two of the missing men through dating apps. In the interview, Bruce admitted that he knew both Hamid and Skanda from a gay bar called Black Eagle. He said that he had employed Hamid in the past and they had a brief sexual relationship, but Bruce ended things with him, and then Bruce denied ever dating Skanda, even though they dated for like 8 years. After this interview, nothing further seemed to be done with the Bruce McArthur tip, and Project Houston was ended after 18 months with no new leads in the 3 murders or 3 disappearance cases at the time. After 4 years of quiet, it seemed Bruce started murdering again in April of 2017. Soroush Mahmoudi, who was 50 years old, was last seen on August 14th, 2015 near his home. Soroush was an immigrant from Iran to Canada. He immigrated when he was around 20 years old. He didn't have many family or friends in Canada until he met his wife. He worked in an automotive parts factory in Barrie for around a decade before moving to Toronto in 2008 to be closer to his wife's family. He was reported missing by his wife sometime in late August 2015. The exact date is unknown. Salim Ehsan, who was 44 years old at the time, was last seen on March 20th, 2017 near Yonge Street in Bloor. Although there are some reports that say that he was actually last seen on April 14th near Toronto's gay village, but these sightings can't be 100% confirmed. He was reported missing by a friend on April 20th, 2017. Police initially were extremely dismissive of Salim's disappearance, describing him constantly in the media as a transient who, quote, often pulled around a wheeled suitcase. A close friend of Salim later came out and said this was highly offensive and incorrect, that Salim was trying to escape an abusive relationship at the time, which is why he didn't have secure housing or housing of his own, but he would often sleep on friends' couches. Salim was born in Turkey and had immigrated to Canada earlier in life with a man who he was in a relationship with at the time. He struggled with drug addiction, but his friends say that he was successful in his recovery around the time that he disappeared in 2017. Salim completed a course on peer counseling at St. Stephen's Community House, which is a social service agency that provides a variety of services to vulnerable people living in Toronto. It was later discovered that Bruce had also gone to St. Stephen's to receive various resources and counseling and stuff. It's unknown if that's how the two met. The next victim is Andrew Kinsman, who was 49 years old, and he was last seen on June 26, 2017 near his apartment in Cabbagetown the day after the Toronto's Pride Parade. Andrew was a superintendent at a Cabbagetown building and was often volunteering in his community. Andrew's sister, Karen Coles, said that she knew Andrew wouldn't have gotten up and left without telling someone, especially because when he disappeared, he left his cat behind. Friends of Andrew confirmed that Andrew had known Bruce for at least a decade prior to his disappearance, and that the pair had briefly dated when Andrew worked as a bartender at the Black Eagle bar. It seems their relationship was on and off for the 10 plus years that they knew each other. It also seems that Andrew briefly worked for Bruce in 2011. After realizing that no one had heard from him in a few days, Andrew's friends went over and entered Andrew's apartment. Nothing seemed abnormal in the apartment except that Andrew's senior cat had run out of food and water. They reported him missing the next day on June 29th, 2017. The seventh victim of Bruce McArthur was Dean Lissawick, who was around 43 or 44 when he went missing. Dean often stayed at a homeless shelter called the Scott Mission that was located downtown from 2003 to his disappearance. He was last recorded as having stayed at the Scott Mission on April 21st, 2016, which was the last time he was seen alive. Dean had struggled with drug addiction for a long time and had previously worked as a sex worker to stay alive, but many who knew him said that he always remained kind and respectful. He was working hard to get back on his feet and overcome all his struggles when he was murdered. Bruce's final known victim was Karushna Kumar. Karushna Kumar was 37 at the time of his death. He arrived in Canada from Sri Lanka in hopes of seeking asylum in August 2010 on a cargo ship. He had a deportation order out on him, which had forced him to go into hiding, so he was never reported missing. He worked as a cleaner and a mover in the years that he lived in Canada. His family reported that they last heard from him in August 2015. After the disappearances of Andrew and Salim, there was an uproar in Toronto's gay community because many believed that there was a serial killer targeting gay men in downtown Toronto. In response, the Toronto police created a task force in July 2017 to look into the murders of Andrew and Salim. They tried to narrow down suspects by tracking down different men that the pair had talked to through dating apps, but investigators found this extremely difficult because the men sort of had a habit of meeting up with random men and having casual sex. The main lead the task force was following was a name that Andrew had written on his calendar. On June 26, 2017, the last day Andrew was seen, Andrew wrote a name on his calendar, and the name was Bruce. Surveillance footage of Andrew on June 26 caught him approaching a red vehicle, which was later identified as a 2004 Dodge Caravan. They matched the make and model of that car to a truck owned by Bruce McArthur. After acquiring a series of warrants, investigators started gathering evidence from August to October 2017 that linked him to the disappearances of 5 men, including Andrew and Salim. They noticed that the red Caravan was no longer parked outside of Bruce's apartment building, so they began searching local auto body shops and part shops around the area to see if they could find Bruce's truck. The vehicle had been purchased by a man named Dominic, who owned an auto parts business. Once the police located the vehicle, they towed it in order to complete forensics on the truck. They found trace amounts of blood in the car, which was later identified to be Andrew's blood. Investigators then started full-blown surveillance on Bruce, which included following him to client's house where he did his landscaping work. One of the many houses that police were following Bruce to was a house located on Mallory Crescent in Toronto. Bruce had made an arrangement with the owners of that house that in exchange for storage space in their garage where he would keep his landscaping equipment, he would maintain their yard. In November, police brought cadaver dogs to this home, but they didn't indicate to any human decomposition or any human remains. After speaking to the management of Bruce's current apartment, investigators received a copy of logs of when his key fob was used to enter and exit the building in between June and September 2017. So alongside a copy of Bruce's cell phone records, they started putting together a timeline of Andrew's murder and disappearance. On January 17th, 2018, after investigators had cloned Bruce's hard drive, they discovered deleted files. When they recovered the files, they realized that some of the files were actually post-mortem photographs of Salim and Andrew's bodies. After this discovery, police said that if they saw him in the company of another person, that they would immediately arrest him. On June 18th, 2018, police were stationed outside Bruce's apartment when they saw a younger man enter the apartment building with Bruce. Fearing for the safety of the unidentified man, police entered Bruce's apartment where they found the young man tied to Bruce's bed. Thankfully, the man wasn't injured and police released him from his binds right away. This unidentified young man had met Bruce through the dating app called Growler. It was reported that this man had immigrated from the Middle East to Canada 5 years earlier, which fits the type of man that Bruce has preyed on in the past. He was also married and his family didn't know that he was gay. He had agreed to let Bruce handcuff him to the bed, but he started to panic when Bruce placed a black bag over his head and tried taping his mouth shut. Police had stopped McArthur before he had the chance to finish with the tape. Bruce was then arrested with 2 counts of first-degree murder for the murders of Salim and Andrew. The police had not yet found their bodies, but they believed they had enough evidence to charge him because of the photographs. After arresting Bruce, police seized a bunch of electronic devices from his apartment, which included 5 cell phones, 5 computers, 3 digital cameras, and dozens of USBs. Across various devices, police found more disturbing photographs of Bruce's deceased victims. The photographs seemed to be Bruce's sort of trophies for these murders. After murdering the victims, it seemed that Bruce liked to pose them and dress them up, and he would stage them for these photographs. For a couple of the victims, he propped them up and put a cigar in their mouth. For a bunch of other photographs, he would put the same fur coat on them and take pictures. Bruce had many photos before and after their death of his victims, and it was reported that he viewed the photos again and again a lot over the years. So he was sort of reliving the murders by looking at the photographs after they happened. Through the photographs, investigators were able to identify at least 8 separate victims, but they needed to find the bodies now. Investigators decided that since Bruce owned his own landscaping business, that they were going to search the properties that he had worked on to see if he had discarded the bodies there. The search ended up including around 30 different properties, and I believed this would later increase to like 90 to 100. They eventually narrowed down the properties to 5 that were sort of extra suspicious, and they started searching on January 18th. The properties included 2 homes belonging to one of Bruce's friends, a condo owned by Bruce's ex-boyfriend, the house where he stored his landscaping equipment, and Bruce's apartment. The first 3 were searched and nothing was found, but they did find evidence at the last 2 properties, which were the house on Mallory Crescent and Bruce's apartment. The search of the home on Mallory Crescent began on January 18th, 2018, after Bruce was arrested. Law enforcement brought in cadaver dogs the following day, and these dogs now identified 2 planters on the property as smelling of human decomposition. Since it was the middle of Canadian winter, it gets really cold here. The planters were frozen to the ground, so they had to bring in heaters, and it took a few days to sort of thaw through the ice and the frozen and the snow. When they were finally thawed through and unfrozen, they were transported to the coroner's office. The coroner found the skeletal remains of 3 men at the bottom of these 2 planters. It appeared that after murdering them, Bruce had dismembered the men and put them at the bottom of the planters. Around 11 days after his initial arrest, Bruce was charged with 3 additional murders, and they were the murders of Hamid, Sharouche, and Dean. On February 8th, it was announced that law enforcement had found 3 additional remains or skeletal remains at the bottom of various planters on Mallory Crescent. They identified one of the 3 bodies as belonging to Andrew through his fingerprints. Over the next few months, Toronto police were gathering forensic evidence from Bruce McArthur's apartment, and as well as searching other properties for more remains. He was charged with the 6th count of first-degree murder on February 23rd for Skonda's death. Sadly, police were initially unsuccessful at identifying one of the deceased men in the photographs, so they had to release a picture to the public using one of the post-mortem photographs that Bruce had taken. They sort of photoshopped it to make it look less grotesque and released it to the public. I'm not going to insert the photograph here, but it is available online. They hoped that releasing this photograph to the public would end up in a positive ID of the victim, but this didn't happen. But police eventually concluded that the victim was Krishna. The public plea to identify him had initially failed because of his circumstances. He was in hiding at the time because of a deportation order, but he was eventually identified by an international agency, which remains unnamed to this day. All except for one of the 8 bodies or 8 skeletal remains of the men were found in various planters on the house on Mallory Crescent, except for Hamid's remains, which were found in a ravine behind the Mallory house. The 8th and final count of first-degree murder was given to Bruce on April 16th, 2018 for the murder of Krishna. Serial killers usually start murdering in their early to mid-20s, or they start experimenting with violence. So it was really disturbing for Toronto police and other criminology academics that it seemed that Bruce had started murdering people in his late 50s. This didn't really match up with the pattern or the pathology of a serial killer, so it is believed that he has many victims, and police and investigators are still looking into cold cases and disappearances to try to identify more victims of Bruce McArthur. After his arrest, Bruce was kept at the Toronto South Detention Center. He was segregated from other prisoners and was constantly kept on suicide watch. The legal proceedings leading up to Bruce McArthur's trial were very long and tedious, and it was eventually concluded that his trial for the 8 counts of first-degree murder would last around 3 to 4 months. But this changed on January 28th, 2019, when Bruce McArthur pled guilty to all 8 charges of first-degree murder. After pleading guilty, facts about the murders were released in a statement to the court. It was reported that Bruce McArthur's bedroom and his apartment was where most of the murders took place. After searching his bedroom, police had discovered a duffel bag that contained duct tape, rope, zip ties, black bungee cord, surgical gloves, and syringes. They also recovered various trophies that Bruce kept from his victims, including Salim's notebook, jewelry from various victims, including Skonda's bracelet that had his name on it, and photographs of 5 of the victims. 6 of the murders were reported to be sexual in nature. They don't really elaborate on what this means, so I'm unsure if it means that he murdered them during sex or just that he had sex with the victims that day. It was theorized earlier that Bruce had met most of his victims off of online dating apps and lured them out to his apartment under the guise of just casual sex. The murders of Skonda and Basir, which were the first 2 murders, were allegedly not sexual in nature. I don't know what this means because it is known that he did have sexual relationships with both of these men previously. I'm sort of concluding that they just weren't having sex that day or while he murdered them. 5 of the murders, it's not specified which murders, involved Bruce tying them up against their will and not allowing them to leave his apartment. He would sexually assault his victims and then strangle them with rope, which is known as ligature strangulation. Then they outlined or detailed Bruce's rituals, which he would complete after the murders. This is probably one of the more disturbing parts for me while researching this. Police found photographs of 7 of the victims, 6 that included staged post-mortem photographs that I described earlier. So as I said before, he would dress them up in a fur coat and put like cigars in the mouth. In other photographs that were recovered, he had posed victims with rope around their neck, sort of mocking their deaths, and he had shaved their heads, which is commonly like used in like sadistic torture to embarrass victims. It's unknown if the shaving of the hair happened before or after the murders. There are 31 photographs of Skanda, including his missing persons poster, which Bruce kept, and 18 photographs of Andrew, which include some with a rope tied around his neck attached to a metal bar, which was the murder weapon in Andrew's murder. The metal bar attached to the rope was supposedly so Bruce could control how much pressure he was putting while strangling Andrew. The bar was later recovered in the van, and Andrew's DNA was found in the van. He also kept bags of his victim's hair, which he stored in Ziploc bags in a shed at a cemetery. And it also appeared that Bruce didn't know the names of 3 of his victims. On February 8th, 2019, Bruce was given the sentence of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole for 25 years. At the time of his sentencing, Bruce was 67 years old, so he won't be eligible until he is 91 for parole. Hopefully he never lives to see that day, because fuck Bruce McArthur. There are a lot of, in my opinion, justified controversies surrounding how law enforcement handled the disappearances of the men and the victims of Bruce McArthur. They face allegations of racism because it was only when Andrew disappeared in 2017 that the police sort of put all their effort into finding him, and Andrew was the only white middle to upper class man that Bruce had murdered. Beforehand, there were rumors of a serial killer in Toronto's gay village for years, and police refused to admit that there was a serial killer and refused to really look that hard into it. Because Skanda had an 8-year relationship with Bruce, and many of Skanda's friends knew that. So to me, it doesn't seem like Bruce should have been a suspect if they properly looked into Skanda's disappearance. Anyways, that's what happened. So then 3 other victims have since come forward alleging that they were assaulted by Bruce McArthur. One occurred in April of 2017. A 52-year-old university prof who had known Bruce for many years prior from Thunder Bay had been contacted by Bruce through a dating app called Bear 411 and agreed to meet him for dinner. After dinner, the pair went to Bruce's van and started to hook up. Bruce became aggressive and viciously twisted the man's neck into his crotch. The victim claims that he felt that Bruce was trying to snap his neck, but he was able to get out by squeezing Bruce's elbow. He did not report the incident to police at that time. The second alleged assault occurred in July of 2017. The man was contacted by Bruce also through a dating app and agreed to partake in BDSM at Bruce's apartment. The man said that Bruce refused to go to his apartment because of security cameras. Bruce drugged the man by giving him an overdose of a GHB cocktail. Bruce, while having sex, which was initially consensual, Bruce started to sexually assault the man by ignoring his limits and his use of safe words. He repeatedly blocked the man's airways with his hands, his penis, and by sitting on his chest until the man lost consciousness. The man was saved after Bruce's roommate returned home and Bruce stopped the assault. The survivor went to police with this information after Bruce's arrest and found out that police actually had a photograph of this man unconscious on Bruce's bed where Bruce was posed in a killing position. The third assault was reported to the police at the time. On June 20th, 2016, Bruce had met a man through a dating site and the pair agreed to meet up. They met up and then they went into the back of Bruce's van. They were parked in a McDonald's parking lot and they began to hook up, and then Bruce started to strangle the man. The man was eventually able to escape the assault and called 911 to report what happened. It was reported that Bruce went to police and said the encounter was consensual and that police decided that Bruce's story was credible and that the encounter was consensual, so they never pursued charges. And the man came forward again after Bruce's arrest in 2017 to report what happened to him. Bruce had reportedly known this man for many years prior to the assault, as he did for many of his victims. There was also photos recovered from Bruce's devices of the man in the fur coat, similar to the other photographs that Bruce had taken of his victims post-mortem. There are more controversies regarding higher-ranking police officers in association with the 2016 assault and Bruce's arrest, but I won't go into that now for the sake of time. So other potential victims of Bruce McArthur, there's a bunch of cold cases of disappearances of men in the 1970s in Oshawa that police are currently looking into in connection with Bruce. There's a man named John Riley who went missing in May 2013 from downtown Toronto, and then there is David McDermott who went missing in November of 2002 from downtown Kitchener, so police are still sort of investigating to see if they can find any other victims of Bruce. So that's it for the sort of story of Bruce McArthur, who is one of Canada's worst serial killers in my opinion. It's a very disturbing story, and really only Canadian outlets covered it, even though it's such an absurd and crazy story. It didn't really get international coverage, so it took a while for me to sort of succinctly gather all the information I needed. I hope you enjoyed the video as much as you can enjoy content like true crime, but you know what I mean. Thank you for watching. I hope you subscribe, and I'll see you next time.